All right. Well, welcome to the Brigger Hall Auditorium. This is amazing. Seriously. This project to create this space, to bring us here where we could be together, to learn from each other, with each other, has been almost or maybe over a decade in action. Involved countless hours of planning and work and implementing and fixing. And look at it, it's beautiful. The screen works, the mics work. And for those of you that used to come to GIA 10, this is much better, right? So this is the first of the HMEI Faculty Seminars in this room. It is the first seminar in this room. It is the first event in this room. So this is the beginning of our new era. And I am thrilled that Professor Jacob Dlamini has agreed to join us and really inaugurate the stage with us. So there's absolutely no pressure. As I was talking to him earlier today, by construction, this will, at the end of today, be simultaneously the worst and the best seminar ever given here. So, set the bar. So Professor Dlamini is a professor in the Department of History and also the director of the program in African Studies. Professor Dlamini is a historian of Africa with an interest in pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial African history. He's also, though, very interested in comparative and global histories of conservations in national parks, which is where this brings together this interface between the High Meadows Environmental Institute and Professor Dlamini's presentation today, which is going to really explore that connection in national parks. And so without further ado, thank you, take it away.
So I should start by thanking Professor Vecchi for the very generous introduction, as well as the invitation to come and present. I would like to thank Hans and Gabrielle for making it possible for us to be together this afternoon. I, of course, need to thank all of you for taking the time out to come and hear me speak on this. And of course, the nice thing about being the first one to do this is that I get to set the bar. And I want to take some comfort in that. Because what I have to present is a deliberate muddle. And it's a deliberate muddle because this is quite a messy project that I've been working on. But I'm going to, present it to you and hope that you have some constructive ideas to give me as I try and give shape to it. So it's been 31 years since the formal end of apartheid in South Africa. And a lot has happened in that 31 years. We've become a democracy that, with all its problems, is somewhat stable and endures. But of course, a lot hasn't changed at the same time. And here I want to share one of my favorite pictures to come out of South Africa. It's a picture from 1994. The woman holding the placard is protesting. It was part of a strike. Taking place at about the same time as the transition was happening. And the sign says in Afrikaans, Mandela, apartheid is nog nie klaar nie. Mandela, apartheid is not yet over, is what the sign says. But it's not just apartheid that's not yet over. For the academy, what is significant is that the practices that define us, as scholars of South Africa, in South Africa especially, are still defined very much by the logic of apartheid. And what this means in practice is that scholars of Indian descent who study South African history focus only on Indian topics, broadly defined. Scholars of colored descent, which is mixed descent, and I'm using South African terminology here, focus on topics that affect only the colored community. Afrikaner scholars focus only on Afrikaner topics, and the exception, and I don't take credit for this, are English-speaking white South Africans who write about everybody else except themselves, right? This hasn't changed much in the 31 years since the formal end of apartheid. So you still have these racial silos that define how people approach topics taken from South African history. And I am trying to change this, and I'm using this project to get at this. And the way that I'm trying to change this approach, or to challenge the way that we continue to follow these racial logics in how we study South African history, is by looking at the history of this park here. So one of about 21 national parks in South Africa. The only park that, in addition to being a national park, is also a World Heritage Site. It acquired that status, through UNESCO in 2003. Became a park in 2004. But there is a much longer history of environmental protection in this part of the country. So just to help you know where this place is, it's bang on the border between Botswana and Zimbabwe. So it's on the border of South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. And are so intertwined are the three regions that for this history to make sense, I have to go beyond the nation state as a frame of reference. In fact, I was there about 3-4 weeks ago now, and there was a pride of lions that had come in from the Botswana side. And to get to this, we actually had to drive all the way into Botswana. So it's that kind of region, right? Formally there are boundaries, but you can actually go back and forth, which is both a blessing but also a curse, in some kinds of ways. Yeah. And to give you a much closer understanding of this national park, which is actually one of the newest parks we have in South Africa. So that's what it looks like, when looked at close up. But you also will notice on this map that, on top of this more current history of Mapungubwe as a national park, is a much older history of Mapungubwe as arguably the most important archaeological site in Southern Africa. And why do I say this? I say this because Mapungubwe, the archaeological site, is the home of this ancient civilization that archaeologists have dated to sometime between 900 and 1100, right? And this is an artifact, it's actually gold foil that was found on top of the hill that defines, the central part of the park, discovered in 1932. By a group of fossickers. Mapungubwe is also very important, historically, because it's a precursor, archaeologists agree, to what we call Great Zimbabwe, or the Zimbabwe ruins, right? And of course, for those of you who grew up reading Rider Haggard, watching King Solomon's Mines, will know that this is the inspiration, right? Behind those literary depictions, right? This is also a source of a lot of controversy in Western Europe, Germany especially, among ethnologists about whether or not this was the place where King Solomon got his gold. Right, so this place is overlaid, with all kinds of interests, that have come to define it, over years. Right, I've just finished a chapter that looks at Karl Mausch, the German explorer, who is the first white man to discover the ruins, and of course he's convinced that this is Ophir. Ophir, which is where Solomon got his gold. But more than that, Mausch is convinced that no African mind could have developed this. No African mind could have designed this, right? And so Mapungubwe is a precursor to, this very fascinating and very interesting place. So how am I challenging this racialized logic that continues to define the study of South Africa's past? I am doing that by paying close attention to, if you're looking at these sediments of meaning that I'm concerned with, by paying close attention to yet another part of the history of this region, yet another part of the history of Mapungubwe National Park, which is its history as a military camp. Right? Set up in 1968, at a time when a conscription of white men into the apartheid military was the law, right? So this is set up in 68, but when it's set up in 68, it's set up with the specific mission that, of course, this is the 60s, right? And South Africa was not immune from what was going on in the 60s, the musical influences, the fashion influences, cultural influences. South Africa was not immune, to any of this, right? And the people in charge, right, these Puritans in charge are looking around and saying, white youth are going astray. Right, that white youth are experimenting with drugs, especially weed, dacha, as we call it in South Africa, but also, and I'm not going to use scare quotes here, but please just keep in mind that, whatever terminology I use, I'm pulling from the sources, right? But also that white youth are experimenting with homosexuality, right, to use the terminology of the time, right? And so the idea that emerges, driven largely by this guy here, Lieutenant General Colin Colcroft, a physician by training, but also one of the key ideologues when it came to the placement of South Africa within the Cold War, right? A key ideologue, and he says that this is a problem that, unless addressed, will lead to the collapse of apartheid, right? That we're losing white youth, and we need to do something about this problem, right? So he comes up with this idea of setting up Mapungubwe, it's called the Greefswald military camp, and to go back, setting up Greefswald military camp as a rehabilitation camp for both gay conscripts but also recreational drug users, right? It's so bad at this camp, right? It's so bad at this camp, which is called Greefswald, that the recruits come to call it very quickly Vreeswald, right? Vreeswald is Afrikaans for forest of fear. Right. The abuse to which conscripts are subjected is such that we get suicides in no time. We get recruits going AWOL. Like, there are all kinds of problems that emerge from this place. Right. And in my focus here, what stands out, and what I think I want to stand out, is the fact that this camp was exclusively for white conscripts. Because conscription in South Africa was exclusively for white conscripts, right? And so that's one obvious challenge to the standard way of approaching, South Africa's racialized, logics of doing history, right? That black historians only do black history. We don't care about this, stuff, because it only happened to white boys who were on the wrong side of history anyway, right? But Colin Colcroft is just a minor figure in the story that I'm trying to tell. The major figure, and this is the part that I should just let you know, this is the part that makes people squirm in their seats because it gets complicated. And I should just point out that I began working on this long before October 7th, right? My interest in this topic predates October 7th by far, right? But a key figure in Greefswald and his operations, right, is this man here, Aubrey Levine, medical doctor, but also a psychiatrist. In fact, Aubrey Levine is the second psychiatrist taken on by the South African military in the late 1960s. And he's the first psychiatrist to work in the military since the Second World War. Right, and this is Levine during one of his bush therapy sessions. Right, he was a great believer. In fact, he's still alive. He lives in Canada now. A great believer in group therapy. Right. And Levine is interesting because at a time when most South African Jews were opposed, to some degree or other, to apartheid, Levine was among a minority of South African Jews who supported apartheid and supported it actively and openly. Right? A quick qualification here. I started working on this long before October 7th, and I'm also not making any facile similarities or comparisons between South Africa and Israel. This is not what this project is about. Right, so please just keep that in mind. Right, what interests me here, right, is the role of someone like Aubrey Levine at Greefswald, right, but also his investment, right, in this military project of dealing with what the military saw as social deviance. Right, so how do we deal with gay white men in South Africa? How do we deal with white men in South Africa who are into recreational drug use? And Levine is interesting, as I'll point out in a second, because he makes his first public entry into the into the record in 1968, at a time when this is at the height of apartheid arrogance, at the height of apartheid hubris, right? If you want to call it that, where black opposition has been defeated, right? South Africans have been driven into exile who are opposed to apartheid, right? So what problem is left to solve? The problem left to solve is of white social deviance, right? And so Parliament in South Africa, looks at what it has, in the statute books to deal with, same-sex relationships, to deal with recreational drug use. Right? So they're looking at this and they're saying, clearly this is not good enough, right? Because we have this problem of white youths, doing all the stuff that we disagree with, right? And so in 1968, the South African Parliament, whites-only Parliament, right, convenes a commission to look into this problem, right? So how do we deal with this, right? Levine writes a letter, uninvited. He writes a letter and he says, you guys are going about all this all wrong, right? You guys think that you can actually cure homosexuality by sending people to prison, right? That you can cure recreational drug use by sending people to jail, right? What you need are doctors, right? What you need are doctors who can offer medical solutions to this problem, right? So this is the first time that, he makes it known. And what's interesting about Aubrey Levine is it's one of those murky, convoluted stories. His father, Mendel Levine, right, was the first Jew in Transvaal, so the old Transvaal in South Africa, to join the National Party, which was a ruling party. And he does this the moment in 1951 when the National Party says, for the first time since the 1930s, Jews can become members, right? Because this is a party that is notorious for its anti-Semitism, right? Notorious for this, right? In fact, I'm hoping that we'll have one student pick up on this. The first country in the world to declare the Protocols of the Elders of Zion a forgery and a libel is the South African court, right, in the 1930s. So there is a history, there is a tradition in South Africa of anti-Semitism, right, that we need to pay attention to, right? But Mendel Levine, the father of Aubrey Levine, is interesting because they position themselves on the side of the anti-Semites, right? They position themselves on the side of the apartheid government, right? And there's a famous account at a National Union of Jewish Students in 1958 where Aubrey Levine, is among a handful, right, the exception, among a handful of Jewish students who, in opposition to a motion saying that Jewish students must oppose apartheid and must state it publicly, he comes along and he says, well, actually, no, it's both compatible with Zionism and with Judaism, right? This is what Aubrey Levine is. So he's interesting in that regard because what interests me here is not his medical practice as such, right, but the politics that informs his medical practice, right, and how he comes, to be, what he comes. This being apartheid South Africa, a lot of this stuff does not come out, right? So what happens, what people like Aubrey Levine get up to at these camps, that doesn't come out, right, until much, much later, right? And so it's only in the 90s, so that's from 1997, when conscripts are starting to complain about what they were subjected to by psychiatrists like Aubrey Levine, right, that you start getting these accounts, right, of what it was like to be at Vryheidsveld, what it was like to be subjected to his therapies, right? And of course, not surprisingly, he quickly earns the name Dr. Shock, because he had a thing for using electroshock, therapy, among other things. But of course, he disputes this. The Truth Commission, which is set up to deal with the crimes of the past in South Africa, tries to go after Levine, and he quickly runs away to Canada, right? If the story would have ended there, except in 2010, Aubrey Levine is arrested by the Canadian police for sexually molesting his patients, in Canada, right? So this is how, the story comes back, to public attention, right? And he's convicted and sent to jail, for 5 years, but he only, because of his age, only serves 18 months, right? And so this is the story. And so this is actually Aubrey Levine when he was in trial in Calgary, Canada. His wife, Erica Levine, actually tries to bribe one of the jurors to have a mistrial declared, and she fails, and she actually is convicted and sent, under house arrest, right? So this is just some of the salacious background that I want to share with you. So what for me is the significance of the story, right? I think it's important in laying out my argument to let you know that in claiming that he could cure homosexuality, right, in claiming that he could cure, drug abuse, right, he was not unique, right? He was not unique. Psychiatrists in America, psychiatrists in Europe were saying the same thing, right? So I don't want you to think that, when it comes to that Aubrey Levine was some aberration, right? That he was some, some crazy wacko, like who didn't know what he was talking about. That he was actually expressing what was conventional wisdom at the time. Right? So when this camp is set up, from 68, and this is the logic and this is the idea, right? This is not something exceptional. So this is important, yeah, because you obviously want to ask the question, so what sets him apart, right? I want to argue that what sets him apart is the politics that drives, his commitment to this project. Right? This idea that you can actually save apartheid, you can help apartheid continue, right, by saving white boys from, social deviance, right? So that for me is a crucial part, of the story, right? But from here, I want to build something additional, right? And that additional thing is to take seriously apartheid as a habit of mind. Right? The thing that we just come to believe in, the thing that we just come to breathe and just live with, right? So how did it work, right? How was apartheid normalized, right? How did it become accepted wisdom, right? That you knew if you were officially black where you were supposed to go to school and you weren't going to try and go to the other school, which wasn't your school, right? That you knew where to shop and where not to shop, right? And so for me, this becomes a window into this process of normalization, like, how apartheid comes to be, this habit of mind that we all just come to grow up with and live with, right? And so this opens a window for me. And part of what makes, Aubrey Levine interesting is that, to take a line out of my colleague Linda Colley's work on the Britons, right, that oftentimes historians go for the exceptional cases, right, that we look at the exceptional cases and then we generalize based on that, right, that far more can actually be gained by looking at conventional types, because by South African standards, he was fairly conventional, right, there was nothing exceptional about him, and this for me is important, right. I also want to point out that the story that I'm trying to tell has not been resistant to telling, right. So here, for example, are just 3 novels, about Mapungubwe, right? But only one of them, right, is concerned with this military history, right? That's been so much neglected. Kill Yourself in Time to Turn, and tellingly, the author was himself one of the first conscripts, right, at this camp, right? So this is significant, right? And it's also worth pointing out, right, that the military interest that we see in Mapungubwe actually predates Greifswald, right? So this is an aerial, photograph. I mean, one of the first aerial surveys done by the South African Air Force in 1932, after the, so-called discovery of Mapungubwe and the discovery of all this gold that came out of it, right? And of course, that starts this, archaeological frenzy, because the archaeologists are looking at Mapungubwe, they're looking at what is being discovered there, and are thinking to themselves, aha, if we figure out the puzzle of Mapungubwe, then we can figure out, who the original inhabitants of this place are and who therefore can claim ownership of this place, right? That is the only way, I think, to understand the investment that predates apartheid for sure, but also that continues into apartheid with the archaeology and the archaeological work that continues at Mapungubwe alongside this military camp and the rehabilitation, of conscripts. It's also worth pointing out, right, that this is not some isolated place, where things are being done in the dark and in secret, right? The U.S. military sends experts to Greifswald to observe how the South Africans are getting it right? Some unnamed country from Latin America, I'm going to guess Chile, if not Argentina, is also sending, its military officers to Greifswald, because clearly the South Africans have figured out, a solution to the problem of social deviance, right? The South Africans themselves are very proud of this fact, and so they advertise it. So some of the stills we have, of military life at Greifswald come from an AP report, widely marketed and advertised, right? But of course, the question of origins, right? So I apologize in advance because these are human skulls, if anyone here is offended. But I do think, for the record, it's important to look at this, right? What Greifswald offers, or what Mapungubwe offers, right, is this possibility, tantalizing, that if we figure this out, we can figure out who then can claim ownership here, right? Because if you open up the question of who can actually claim ownership here, then whites have as equal a claim to South Africa as, as the Africans do, right? Alex Galloway was was an anatomist at the University of Witwatersrand, my alma mater. So he becomes the expert, when all this gold and all these guys are discovered, he becomes the person charged with figuring out, okay, so who were these people? Right? So who were these people who built the civilization that is a precursor to Great Zimbabwe, right? And he concludes very shortly that, whoever these people were, they were not African. Right? That whoever these people were, they were a special type called the Boskopoid. Right? So he makes up an entire line, of hominin and says that these are the people who can claim ownership. Right? And for him, what's at stake is not just saying that these local Africans are just too silly to give us this kind of civilization, but that there was this much more important, much more crucial civilization to which we as Europeans can be linked. Right. So this then becomes a way of saying that we can explode, the assumption that Africans have prior claim to this place by calling into question, who the original inhabitants are. And Galloway has a solution to this, that the original inhabitants are this Boskopoid, type. Right. So that's what that is. Unless you think that this is, again, some marginal thing that, just, starts, in the 1930s and peters out in the 1930s. This is, an image taken from a pamphlet produced in the 1970s by the South African government for its New York consulate, in counter to the anti-apartheid movement, where, people are, increasingly in the U.S. And in other parts of the world, increasingly saying what's going on in South Africa is wrong and we need to challenge it. Right, and so they, they offer this as a way of showing that, well, actually, this idea that, whites are settlers, this idea that, whites are usurpers, but that, natives are actually, the indigenous owners, that idea is false and it's nonsense. Right? That in fact, if you look at the map, right, you'll see that, Europeans and the so-called Africans actually showed up here at about the same time. Right? So no one has any greater claim. To this, right? So this then becomes yet another way of justifying why apartheid, was the right thing, to do. Right? And so that's, the bigger argument here that I'm concerned with, right? How this opens up these questions of, who can claim ownership, who can claim belonging, but also, how in the course of that, right, you also have this other work. Right, this other work of normalizing not just the white claim to South Africa, but the white men themselves, right? Because this for me is crucial. So how have I been doing this work? And I'm going to wind up here. So the way that I've been doing this work is not just through archival research, where I'm going in to look at military archives and other relevant materials, but by talking to the men who were at this camp. Right, by talking to the people who were directly affected here. In fact, so with this photograph, so that is Mapungubwe Hill, right? And here is a viewing deck. So this is now Mapungubwe National Park. So this is a viewing deck. So Rob McCarvey volunteered as a medic at this camp. Gordon Tor is the guy who wrote Kill Yourself in Counter 10. And he was one of the first conscripts, sent there. He was actually, I have permission to mention some of these details because these men think it's important to mention this. He was actually abused by Aubrey Levine. And then this is Ewan McGregor, whose brother was conscripted in 1973 and committed suicide about 4 weeks in, to his time. And in fact, where this deck is now is actually called McGregor's Rock, named so by the conscripts who were there when the suicide took place, but also, those who came after, right? And so being able to speak to Ewan, so that Ewan and his sister Joanne, so just being able to talk to them, as conventional, white South Africans, but also just to ask them just basic questions, like, why is it that, you never seem to have talked about the possibility of, evading conscription or, moving somewhere. These questions that we take for granted, right? Only because we focus on the exceptional cases, right? So that for me has been, quite interesting. So this is the brother Stuart McGregor, who committed suicide. And so in making sense of this, like, so part of what I'm trying to get at, right, is how ordinary, normal, average, white South Africans ended up as victims of apartheid, right? Because I do think it's important, to point this out, right? So that we move away from this idea that the only victims of apartheid were black South Africans, right? But without equalizing, what the black experience of apartheid was with what the white experience was, right? So that's the McGregor family. And the last person I took, and I'm going to stop after this, to Mapungubwe, is this man here. And again, I have permission to mention his details because these are important. So he's one of the few former conscripts I've found who identified openly as gay, right? And in fact, he says the mistake he made. So he was conscripted in '77 when he shows up, and the first day of basic training. They have to run, I forget how many miles, and he collapses at the end of the day. And when he comes to, he is in the military hospital, like with an IV, running down his arm, and he's thinking to himself, "I need to get out of this." And so a social worker attached to the military comes to the room and says, "What's going on?" And so he thinks to himself that, well, if I tell them that I'm gay, they'll let me go. Right? So he says, well, I don't think I belong here. I don't like this. I don't like guns. I don't like shooting. And I'm attracted to other men. So he thinks they're going to send him home. But no, they send him up to Greifswald. Right? And so part of what makes the story complicated for me, that he's also, when he gets to Greifswald, he's also attacked. But he also wants me to understand that the 13 months that he spent at this camp were not just the worst years of his life, but also the best years of his life, right? And in fact, he says at one point that when I die, I'm hoping that my ashes will be scattered, in this place, right? So there's no redemption here. There's no easy arc, where, things start here and they end over there, right? It's a messy, complicated, convoluted story, and that's what I've been, trying to work with. But I do think paying attention to the white experience of apartheid and using that not just to validate, these old myths about who the victims were and who the beneficiaries were, but by telling something, much more complicated, much more interesting, we might actually get at some of this big question that I have about how this society and its logics became a habit of mind. Look, how we just came to assume that, of course, if you're a white boy, at some point you're going to go to the military. That's what you do. Right? How we came to that. So that's the work I've been trying to do, and that's what I've come to present. So thank you very much for hearing me out and not throwing potatoes at me. I truly appreciate it. Thank you.
So I think the way we're going to work it now, and this is a change for the way we did it in Geo 10, because we now have this great stage. Jacob, if you join me at the comfy chairs. We have comfy chairs, and what we will do is we have people running mics in the audience, and also for those of you listening online, there's a way to send questions and comments, if you will, and I'll open it up for questions from anyone. So, Jacob, and while you formulate your questions, you mentioned, and you started with that image that you liked. It was written in Afrikaner, and you translated it for us. That sort of imploring to Mandela that apartheid is not done, and you said it's still. But just to what extent and what ways do you think present day is connected in a simple way to what went on? I mean, the history in this place is quite outstanding, right? Going back hundreds of years, but even just in the last 50 years. Is there a clean connection between the present and 50 years ago in your mind here?
I think it depends on what you're looking at. I mean, if you're looking at the levels of violence in South Africa, if you're looking at the levels of segregation that still defines South Africa, I think there's obviously a connection here, right? But of course, there's also been a lot of change, right? So that's not. I don't for a second want to make it sound like there is no difference. I mean, there's a difference. I've spent some time in Brazil. I've spent some time in India, but I can't think of a country that offers the moral challenge that just daily life in South Africa offers. Because I think you're confronted in South Africa daily, from the moment you leave your door to the moment you make it your destination, with the legacy of apartheid, the legacy of brutality, in ways that are unavoidable unless you deaden the soul. Right? I mean, it's always, when I take my kids home, it's always a challenge because after, they're constantly seeing this, like constantly seeing, people begging on the streets and constantly asking, like, but why is this so? It's just being there as this constant moral challenge. But there's also the violence we live with that I think scars us in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. So I think going back to this, it is a crime scene, and going back to this crime scene and saying things happened here, and there has to be some sort of reckoning is for me important, right? Yeah, I don't know if this answers Gabe's question. Yeah.
No, but thinking about this crime scene, which is also, from your images, a gorgeous place where biodiversity is allowed to flourish, and how do you those can those rattle around comfortably?
I think they can, and I think that's how we live, right? I think that's how. Because I mean, it is amazing. Like if there's, so what do white South Africans and black South Africans have in common? And I use black politically to mean, people of Indian descent, people of colored descent. What do they have in common? Like there's this love for the place, right? That lives, alongside some of the worst forms of racism, some of the worst forms of, homophobia and sexism you'll ever encounter, right? There's this constant return to the beauty of the place, right? It is a contradiction, but I think it's a contradiction that allows people to live, right? That I might not like my neighbors because they don't look like me, but what a gorgeous place this is, right?
And we have a question there, and then a few more.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, with the last individual you talked about, this conflict between, it's a terrible year and it's also the greatest year. So what made it so great?
Yeah, I mean, this is Gabe's question. So I've had a hard time. I mean, I've been talking to some of these men for, like 4 years now. And I have to respect what he says. I mean, of course, I can question and can push back, but there's a limit to how far I want to push, because he wants to hold on to this idea that this was the best place that he's ever been to. He wants his ashes scattered there. And so when I ask him, but what is it about the place? And he just says, he points to the vistas. He just points to the landscape. And he says, just this. Right? And that's what he says. And it's also, I think, important to point out that, when these men went in there, they were 17, they were 18, they were kids. They were kids. And for him, I think it was the first time he'd been away from home. He comes from a working class, white working class family. The father was an artisan. I think the mother was a stay-at-home, parent. So solid working class stock. And this was his first time away from home. In fact, when I thanks to the department and to the university, when I flew him to Mapungubwe, I mean, the man is 67. It was his first time flying. He's 67. White South African. It was his first time on a plane. So I think the opening up of possibilities and opportunities, I think might have something to do with it.
That was really powerful, Jacob. Thank you for giving us a sense of how the space, the military organization, and really destructive understandings of psychiatry and anti-Semitism are all somehow entangled here. I'm really struck at how you're able to show that the racial hierarchy was not only about oppressing blacks and other colored people, but also about disciplining whites into certain kinds of social norms and behaviors. I'm wondering how this played out for women. Almost all the actors in your story are men. And is there a parallel story about the enforcement of gender norms that you see if you look beyond male sexuality here?
So thank you, Angela, and thanks for your support. So It's not an easy question to answer. It's beyond the level of the logics that define the place for me. So this expectation that, if you're a white woman, this is how you shall behave. So talking to someone like Joanne Baines, whose brother died, has been important, to me, because I've been able to ask questions like, well, what was it like having your brothers in the military, right? And in some ways, it's a silly question to ask, because for them, that's just what boys did, right? It was just taken for granted that boys did that. But beyond that, actually, I don't know that I have a good answer. Because, there was no conscription for white women. In the 1980s, there was talk of introducing it, but they never went that far, right? The only, a woman present at Greefswald was the nurse, who also happened to be the wife of the commanding officer, right? And so, in their reminiscences, the man will talk about nurse so-and-so. But I'm gonna have to think about this, because I do think that this is exactly.
It's okay if the answer is no.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That was really compelling. It's a terrific project. I have a question that's somewhat related to Gabe's question about the possibility of beauty and crime scene rattling around together, and that is, and then I have a quasi comment question. But the first is, how does the park make visible or not these histories today? How are they present? Are they absent? How does the park navigate that? And the second question has to do with archaeology. I was really, really interested in what you had to say about the role of archaeology as a kind of scientific arm of imperialism / apartheid. And as you were talking about the excavations, and then you showed the human remains, and then you described the argument that such works of architecture and culture couldn't possibly have been made by Africans, all I could think about was the equivalent in early archaeology in the United States, which is a mirror image of what you described. And so this is a comment, because I think if you haven't looked into the literature on this, it might be useful. But I'm also wondering if these excavations participate in a larger conversation, a more global conversation about archaeology and its politics.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for that great question. Actually, I just want to show you the slide. So this actually was the camp. And in my interviews with the former conscripts, almost all of them talk about the swimming pool and just how important the swimming pool was to them. But that swimming pool doesn't exist anymore because the new order decided, when this became a national park, to get rid of any sign that there was once a military camp there. And so students out here in the audience, I don't recommend this. But on this last trip, I brought back, so if you look around the pool, there are these beautiful mosaics. I actually brought back a piece because even though they destroyed the pool, they just left the remnants there, right? And yeah, so I brought one back just to give me something to hold on to. So there is no official acknowledgement that this wasn't just an archaeological site, but also a military camp, designed with a particular purpose in mind. And this is, I'm being cynical here, because I don't know that this is deliberate. I just think it's indifference to history, coupled with ignorance, right? So I don't think that the new order decided that, we don't want this history told, because it messes with our notions of who the victims were and who the beneficiaries were. So there's that. But so Rachel, thanks for the question. I think should make it clear that in talking about the archaeology of the place, that I don't make it sound as if every archaeologist who was there served a particular purpose, because a lot of what we know, and it's good work, came from the archaeological digs that took place there. So for example, when starting with people like Karl Mausch and people who come after that, when you have these incessant claims that no black mind could have designed
these beautiful, beautiful gold objects, and no black man could have, built, Great Zimbabwe. Who are the people who are saying, actually, this is nonsense, right? It's fellow white archaeologists, right? Gertrude Cotton, Thompson is brought out specifically to settle the question, of Great Zimbabwe, and she spent some time here too. Right? So it's not the case that it is actually something that I need to fix in how I tell the story. So it's not the case that archaeology as a discipline served a particular purpose, but there were these very serious divisions, within archaeology. And it's the same when we come to military psychiatry, that the worst psychiatrists were saying that this is wrong. We should not be doing this. We cannot be doing this. Right? So I think figuring out a way to tell the story while also being open about, the multiple directions that the story is going, is going to be crucial for me. Yeah.
I saw.
Hi, thank you so much, Jacob. I was really struck by how so many of the questions you're grappling with are the ones that Fanon is grappling with at the same time in Algeria in very different ways. But my question is really about the question of the land and like the urban-rural divide, and who are these youth that are being sent to such a rural place? Are they predominantly urban youth? And is there a question of like returning to the land? And in addition to like the torture that they're undergoing, the idea of like laboring on the land. I was just wondering about those like connections that are such a big part of other quote unquote like social reform movements at this time period.
Yeah, Lacey, thank you. That's a great question. So one telling detail, like, if we're thinking South Africa and all the assumptions we bring with us each time we hear South Africa and apartheid, one telling detail is that there was not a single black laborer at this camp. Like, not a single black person working at this camp. There were, black folks who lived across in Bechuanaland and Rhodesia, which then becomes Zimbabwe in 1980, right? And in fact, because of its location, the camp actually never works as a rehabilitation center because, the conscripts constantly go through, cut through, Limpopo to get to the other side. I don't have a picture here, but, Limpopo, there are times when it actually just doesn't flow, right? And all you have is just a sand channel, right? And so people are constantly moving back and forth, right? And conscripts know this. So, you want to score some, not to use the terminology, you want to score some weed, you just walk across, to the other side. And that's what they do. And in fact, the camp is finally closed in 78 because a group of them, goes across to score. And they attack, two women on the Botswana side. And then they run back, across. But then when they get back to camp, one of them realizes, oops, I left my hat at the crime scene. So he runs back to go get his hat. Meantime, the villagers alerted the police. And so when these guys go back to get their hat, the cops are waiting for them. So they get arrested. And now you have this international, controversy of, a group of white boys about to face a capital sentence in Botswana. And so after that, the South Africans say, this place needs to be shut down. Besides, it's too close to Rhodesia, it's too close to Botswana, that strategically, as a military facility, it's actually useless, right? It will get overrun in 2 seconds, right? And so they shut it down. So that's what happens. As to the class composition, I puzzled over that because I was struck by the disproportionate number of English speakers among the conscripts, right? But I don't know that there was anything beyond just random chance, behind that, because they all came from different parts of the country. Right? Yeah, so I don't know that there was a deliberate policy to target, the English speakers, for example. But the conscripts will make claims about how Aubrey Levine, reserved particular ire for Jewish conscripts who, didn't want to be there, right, and made it known that they didn't want to be there. English speakers who were vocal about, they were doing this because, it was either that or jail or exile. And so there was just something about, English speakers that he just had a thing for. And I think to understand that, we have to understand this idea that Afrikaners are by definition loyal, but English speakers, Lebanese, Jewish, were always suspicious. Right. And so someone like him would want to pay, particular attention. That's what I would say.
Precious.
Thank you. Interesting talk. So maybe I'll start by apologizing for going to the practical aspect of this. So going back to how you started, so you talked about the discovery of the Mapungubwe and the Great Kingdom, that connection. So one of the legacy of apartheid has always, and one of the aspects was to suppress the history of African development prior to that. So I think even the knowledge of the language that we've spoken around that region, even that history, is very, very little is known about it. And the slide about Mandela, that apartheid is not yet gone. So do you think that there is a narrative here about thinking about the future of South Africa by having both the pain and the legacy of great development? Because I think looking at Mapungubwe also open up a lot about the African empires that were very, very strong. And actually during that time, even going to the Roman Empire, going back, but this is little is known about this. And I think that the apartheid regime was very successful in, talking down that history. And do you think that there is an opportunity to empower as a way to unite by going back to something that was common to the both Africans as well as white? Because I think there's a struggle to unite within the recent history of apartheid because of the fresh wounds. Do you think, is there a narrative there, or am I over pushing the argument of both talking about what happened, that the strength of the African empire as well as the pain of the white South Africans, to say, is there a narrative to possibly unite? Because South Africa still remain divided on this topic, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
So Precious, thank you. You're asking one of my favorite South African questions. Because if I give a similar talk in South Africa, oftentimes, people in the audience will say, oh, but, the apartheid government went out of its way to make sure we didn't know about this, right? Or that there was this deliberate, active suppression of our history. But in fact, that's not the case. Right? This is actually not the case. Right? The investment that, this place is so remote, right? That the only thing that made the archaeological work that took place possible was military support, right? But also military infrastructure, right? So it wasn't just a case that, you had this military base here, but long before that, the military would loan its trucks, would help with water, because it's a remote place, very dry. There never was an attempt, as far as I can see from the evidence, right, to pretend that this thing didn't happen or didn't exist. They were always open about it. So the collections, for example, we have all the stuff, right? Because very early on, the government, this is very interesting for me, the government, as early as 1932, the government, so before apartheid, the government comes along and says, this is precious material, right? We need to preserve this. Right, and in no time, the University of Pretoria, becomes the leading archaeological place for research into this place, right? And resources are poured into it, right? There's this constant traffic, of researchers from the University of Pretoria going to this place, right? Of course, this is at a time when the University of Pretoria was exclusively white, right? So it's all white archaeologists, all white researchers, right? But the finds, from here are widely advertised, widely publicized. All you have to do is just read the newspapers, right? Because these people are proud of this, right? But what this gives them, right, is this chance to call into question, this idea that, this is African, that Africans have prior claim to this, right? So it's not that they're saying, oh, look, what amazing work these blacks did, right? But they're saying, oh, look what an amazing civilization this is. Now we have to figure out who did this. Right? And in fact, there is, I didn't show it to you, there's one, archaeologist who's also a military officer who makes precisely this point, right? That this is important and we need to teach our blacks. This is how, apartheid, spoke officially. We need to teach our blacks about the importance of this, right? So that they will know what can be done, right? So that's what I'd say. Yeah, we need to know about this, but I think only because we need to read books, right?
Okay, so I unfortunately just got a message, and I was told that we need to move the talk. And this is because of the timing of classes and everything. So, which brings me to my next point. So traditionally for years, this seminar series began at 12:30 in the afternoon. Starting next month, we're going to begin at 12:15 in the afternoon. The reason being Princeton shifted its class schedules, and so we want to align better with this. So starting on Tuesday, October the 7th, the new start time will be 12:15. Lunch will be served outside in the atrium at 11:45. And that'll let us not have to hurry at the end. And our second speaker for the fall of 2025 will be Professor Eric Tate from Princeton's School of Public International Affairs. And the talk will be on advancing social vulnerability modeling for equitable flood adaptation. So with that piece of information and a wonderful presentation and discussion, I'd like to once again thank Professor Dlamini, and please join me. Thank you.